Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our discussion for today, Saturday, January 27th, 2024. Lots to go over today, so let's get right on with it. Starting off with our headlines for today's video. El Nino weakening, but incoming westerly wind bursts could hold it on for slightly longer. And that does lead back, of course, to our title card question, which is how much longer will El Nino last? And that's what we're going to be talking about a lot in today's discussion, as well as an incoming pattern change in the United States. And this could have implications as well on sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic, which will be important to monitor, especially for hurricane season. It's all connected, trust me. So this does have some sort of relevance to that as well. And new changes that have just been mentioned by the National Hurricane Center. They're making new changes to their forecast cone for this season, and they're pretty interesting. That we'll talk about towards the end of the video. So stay tuned for that if you want to see that. Starting off though with the NOAA Coral Reef Watch sea surface temperature anomalies, as we always do every single week. Very warm Atlantic, that signal remains. Look at these anomalies off the northwestern coast of Africa and even off Western Africa too. 2 degrees Celsius and even some 3 degrees Celsius beginning to pop up off the western coast of Africa as well. And that extends all the way back into the Caribbean too, and even into the Gulf. Anomalies averaging out at least 1 degree Celsius above normal throughout the entire tropics. So that means for sure there's a lot of energy in the ocean, and that would definitely feed into potentially a lot more energy in the atmosphere by the time we get to the season. So one thing for sure that will probably not be a concern at all this season is how much energy there is in the ocean, and there's definitely an abundance of that this year. Even with El Nino too, El Nino still remaining pretty strong. Some of these anomalies here still around 2, even 3 degrees Celsius in the equatorial region. So El Nino is still there and will likely persist over the next few weeks before we begin to see La Nina appear, and even in the northwestern Pacific as well has warmed up over the last several weeks too. Generally not too much of a concern though right now. Of course, even with the Atlantic being as warm as it is right now, it is only January, almost February, still several months away from the season. A closer look though at the sea surface temperature anomalies. This is more or less kind of averaging them out over the specific regions that we look at. First of all, the Nino 3.4 region. Increased trades, and we've been seeing this since the new year, an increase in trades over the tropical Pacific. We've seen a huge tank in the Nino 3.4, almost over, actually, 2.2 degrees Celsius earlier in the year once we reached the new year, and then ever since then we've dropped down significantly. Now we're only at 1.6 degrees Celsius as of the latest update. Still in strong El Nino territory, but we've definitely begun to see weakening, and probably weakening that will continue over the next few weeks as of course we do see neutral and then eventually La Nina set in closer a lot later in the year. And even in the MDR too, we've seen an increased trade burst over the last week or so. That's really tanked sea surface temperature anomalies, but there's also been, I think, some Saharan air that has kind of exited Africa and is kind of lurking in the eastern Atlantic right now, which I do believe could also be knocking down some of these sea surface temperature anomalies as well. I think, I kind of do have a theory sometimes when we do get some sort of Saharan air situation, especially towards the season sometimes, because a lot of these sea surface temperature anomaly methodologies tend to be satellite based instead of actually based on records at the surface, although I think it could be a combination of both. Not entirely sure, but sometimes the bottom line that I'm trying to get at is with these Saharan air outbreaks, the satellite kind of knocks down the sea surface temperature anomaly readings because of the Saharan air outbreak, sometimes colder to what they actually are. So maybe that's why we've seen such a huge tank. But bottom line, we're still over a degree Celsius above normal, and we've been over even 0.8 degrees Celsius above normal for the entire timeline since November. So Atlantic is still plenty warm, and it'll probably remain so over the next few weeks and months, probably leading up into hurricane season. Another kind of sea surface temperature anomaly map we tend to look at. This is the equatorial anomalies looking below the surface. So we have the anomalies that I showed you before. That's the kind of the sea surface temperature anomalies at the surface. This is looking at it though below to kind of show what's going on in terms of our El Nino versus our La Nina. And very interestingly enough, look at this. The colder anomalies here below the Pacific surface have been extending towards the east, and this has been the case since last year, rapidly extending anomalies towards the east into the eastern Pacific. This is what is eventually going to help us kickstart our La Nina, or our sort of enso-neutral event that we'll see later this year. And this will continue, and I say continue because it's already happening. Notice at the beginning of the kind of frame, you notice there's all these warm anomalies that extend pretty decently below the surface. So there was a huge ground that this El Nino had. And now as we head towards the later frames, look at that. We only see these warmer anomalies associated with the El Nino near the surface. So that means these anomalies here are starting to gain a lot of ground, and eventually as they make their way towards the surface, El Nino will end, and we'll eventually see La Nina thereafter begin. It's all part of a process that's happening, and it's going to take several weeks, but eventually we will see this La Nina sort of come to the surface, and El Nino will then be the end of what it is right now. The SOI dashboard, though, and this is very interesting and also kind of shows to go the process that is going on right now. The current 30-day average is at 7 points. That's, I think, up from last time we talked. It has been increasing since the beginning of the month, of course, because of the increase in trade winds, as I mentioned earlier. But generally, that does show we are beginning to see a shift in the atmosphere away from this sort of El Nino pattern and beginning to favor La Nina. The average 90-day SOI, I believe this one is honestly the more important one to look at when we're looking at long-term sort of impacts to the pattern. That is still in the negative, so we're still kind of borderline with that, but definitely at least reflective in the last 30 days. We're beginning to see that pattern shift, and will probably continue to do so over the next few weeks. But I do want to mention this is the zonal wind anomalies, and this is to kind of put into perspective what's going on in the last few weeks. And starting off, though, before we look at all this, you could see how we've seen a weakening sort of trend with this El Nino. Look at all these greens and these blues, and that is trade winds. This is, of course, averaged. By the way, this is averaged over the equatorial Pacific, so this kind of gives an idea of the zonal winds that have been happening near where this El Nino sort of situation is. Right where we like to look at it in terms of El Nino development. And you do notice zonal winds have been stronger. We've seen more of an easterly trade flow over the last few weeks, and this is what's helped us see the weakening trend we're seeing in this El Nino right now. But look at this as we head into time, into the future. Kind of looking into the future. Kind of cool, right? But here we see over the next few weeks from this point on, this is the line. This is where we are right now. And as we go below that, this is looking into the future. And what do you notice? We see a lot of these green anomalies turn into these oranges. And that does actually mean a westerly wind burst. And this is being forecasted by multiple models over the next few weeks. We will see increased westerly winds over the Pacific. Several things are happening. We're seeing the jet extend once again. That is currently kind of changing things up in the United States right now from the cold we saw over the last 2 weeks to a much more warmer pattern this week. But eventually that'll change as well, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But also, westerly winds will occur across the Pacific. A more El Nino-like response returning again, and that'll probably keep this El Nino going, at least keeping it persistent for a few more weeks. So definitely, when we're going back to the question, how much longer will El Nino last? Definitely seems to be a case that we'll see it persist at least for a few more weeks longer. And this is another perspective, the CFS V2 zonal wind anomalies. They also show that as well. These kind of oranges too, representative of westerly winds across the Pacific. So we'll probably see El Nino last much longer than for at least a few more weeks. And look at that in the Atlantic too. And this is kind of shifting gears to our second part in terms of the United States. and what implications that'll have in the Atlantic. Notice once again these westerly winds here in the Atlantic as well, and that we'll talk in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes. But first, I do want to mention MJO as well. That does as well have an influence on what we're seeing right now. And MJO is in the Pacific in phases 6 and 7. At least that'll be the case over the next 2 weeks. And that is, of course, the favorable phases of the El Nino, or at least the typical phases that we see in an El Nino event with the MJO. Phases 6 and 7. So obviously that means we'll probably see westerly winds, and of course a more El Nino atmospheric response occur when we see the MJO in the Western Pacific, and that does last into at least the early part of February before a bunch of these longer range ensembles take it into phases 8 and 1, and that's when we'll really see the pattern change occur, which a lot of people expect will be sometime next month once the MJO moves into phase 8 and 1, and that'll also have an impact, which will probably begin as we head into the first week of February in terms of overall pattern in the Atlantic as well. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But kind of going back what I mentioned earlier, as we're seeing with this sort of pattern we're seeing right now, and Eric Webb kind of breaks it down really well, the extension and equatorward shift of the Pacific jet in a January-February Nino winters. So he does mention this is a typical pattern that we're seeing in a El Nino winter. He mentions that this is linked to the Southern Pacific Convergence Zone northeast of Australia. And very interestingly enough, he mentions this is also a pattern, at least with the Southern Pacific Convergence Zone, that does long-term help terminate large El Nino events. And he kind of does back that up, kind of showing a composite of all the biggest El Nino years we've had over the last few decades, and that pattern does show up in the Southern Pacific. Very interesting indeed, because that does show, once again, it is all part of a process that is occurring right now, and a process that will probably continue over the next few weeks as we eventually see this shift from El Nino to La Nina that'll come probably later on in the year occur. Just kind of putting into perspective that we are, and it is very likely that we will see this shift from El Nino to La Nina. Just kind of trying to point it out, at least with overall pattern signals that we're seeing right now occur. But that, of course, being aside, now shifting towards United States weather, as I did mention, a pattern change is coming from the United States. First, short term, and that is a warm up because of the Pacific jet. And that you could look online. Everybody's talking about it. But then people are also talking about the pattern change after that, and that'll be back towards colder in the eastern half of the United States. I know a bunch of snow lovers, including myself, we're all getting excited. But here's the weeks 3 to 4 outlook by the Climate Prediction Center, and even them, they show below normal potential for the current temperatures across the eastern United States. And this is closer towards the mid to the latter part of February. And this is also backed by the NAO, and that's what we're going to talk about now. The North Atlantic Oscillation, that begins to change as well. One thing you do notice, and probably the most important thing to point out, is a bunch of these heights that you see, these blues and these reds. These blues are lower than normal heights, and these reds, of course, and these oranges represent higher than normal heights. And that's what we have right now, and this is what's causing our warm-up. We see a strong ridge over Canada that brings warmer air from the Gulf of Mexico up into the United States. That's what's going to allow at least for our warm-up over the next week. But then after that, look what happens. We see a huge ridge of high pressure begin to develop over Canada, and we see lower than normal heights take over across the Atlantic. And you do notice, once this does load again, you notice a bunch of these heights kind of undercut this ridge over Canada into the southern United States. Representative one, a transition that we're seeing right now from a positive to a negative NAO, which is the North Atlantic Oscillation, and number two, the southern jet stream becoming very active. Two things which are pretty common that typically happen during El Nino winters, as Eric Webb mentions. But it's also interesting because once we do see the NAO turn negative, this does tend to allow for the zonal wind anomalies to turn westerly in the Atlantic. And that's what I showed earlier with the CFS, right? See everything coming full circle? Gotta always think outside the box. That's one thing for sure when you get into talking about climatology and tropics. You got to think outside the box because a lot of things do relate back to each other. So you got to get creative. But most importantly, what I'm mentioning now, westerly winds do overtake the Atlantic. So that means weaker trade winds across the tropical Atlantic, and therefore we'll probably see warming too. And just to show both models, the main models, the European and GFS ensembles, roughly around hour 240. So this is heading into early February once we see the pattern change begin to occur back to cold. And of course, we also begin to see those lower than normal heights in the subtropics Atlantic. Notice these red anomalies here. That's westerly winds beginning to take over in the tropics, and that does help the Atlantic warm as well. And really quickly, if you're not really familiar with the NAO, this is the NAO in a positive phase, and this is generally what we have right now. Lower than normal heights over Greenland and higher than normal heights across the subtropics Atlantic. Not as active southern jet, well, as opposed to the NAO, complete opposite, obviously. Higher than normal heights over Greenland, and this allows for the southern jet to become active, and of course, weaker than normal trade winds and the lowering of pressures across the general subtropical and tropical Atlantic, which is what will help the Atlantic warm and probably remain warm over the next few weeks heading into the spring. And that, of course, has even more interesting implications on hurricane season. That does shift us now, though, as we always do like to talk about current weather across the United States. And I did see quite a few interesting things this week. One, this week apparently was the foggiest week on record in the United States, or something like that. I saw a tweet about that. But I did see earlier this week there was a whole lot of dense fog advisories in effect for basically the entire central United States. It was really an incredible sight. And they're still in effect right now for portions of the Midwest, Illinois, I believe Chicago in there as well, and even some in Wisconsin too, and even extending back towards Ohio. And then we have these, I believe, flood watches in effect, or flash flood watches, I'm not quite sure, but there is a system moving through, and that actually will bring snow once again to interior portions of the United States heading into tomorrow and into Monday too. So that is a weather system in the making. And then severe weather too, as I did mention, there is a weather system moving through. So slight risk is in effect for potential severe weather across the southern United States. There's a decent tornado risk with this as well, 5% chance for tornadoes and a 15% chance for hail. Luckily, not anything that significant, especially not compared to a few weeks ago. If you remember, we had quite a few pretty devastating tornadoes in the Florida Panhandle, that area getting it again. Hopefully not as bad this time around. Extending after that, though, days 2 and 3, quiet down. Even day 3, there's no thunderstorms forecasted at all by the Storm Prediction Center, which is good. Quiet down in weather after that, and eventually that will probably lead to our pattern shift into early February. So that is that with United States weather. But really quickly before we go, I did want to mention the hurricane cone is changing, and this is mentioned by multiple people, but I found this tweet specifically by Anthony Yanes, I believe. He's from a TV station, I believe this is in Houston, and he talks about it. The hurricane cone is changing this upcoming hurricane season, and instead of a track forecast, he does mention the forecast will now include hazards. And one of those hazards included, look at that, they're including inland tropical storm watches and warnings, and those type of watches and warnings we always see, hurricane and tropical storm, though are including the inland watches now too, instead of the watches just along the coast. So basically what they're trying to do is broaden out the representation for the hazards that people will see, not just limited to the coast, but extending inland from the coast as well. And I believe that is a very useful tool, especially we could take that from the last few seasons. One storm we could go back to is Ida. Definitely was a really bad storm for Louisiana. We all remember that Category 4 landfall in southeastern Louisiana, but the impacts extended all the way to the northeast, where we had a flash flood emergency in New York City, well removed from the landfall all the way down in Louisiana. So this is definitely a valid change, I do believe, and it'll be interesting to see it in motion this hurricane season as well. Lots of changes, lots of things to change over the next few weeks. Certainly very interesting, though. But I do want to take a moment, as obvious. If you did like what you saw today, would really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe. I'm on YouTube. I'm also on Twitter. Just search up my name, and I should be one of the first people to pop up. You could follow me on Twitter as well. And if you want to start a conversation on Discord, that's my Discord handle. Ask me any questions if you have any questions about hurricane season or even United States weather too. I'll be happy to answer. And also, if you just want to start a conversation, say hi. We'll like it as well. Always got to get the engagement going, and obviously some sort of connection as well, which I hope we're able to do over the next several weeks. That's going to wrap it up for this video, though. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Once again, another video next Saturday. Maybe if something else pops up over the week that's interesting, I'll post about that too. But doesn't look like anything will. So just, of course, next Saturday and every Saturday, obviously. That's at least our schedule for the off season, though. Of course, if you're interested and you're new, once again, subscribe. Would really suggest that. Thanks for watching, though. Stay safe, and we'll talk again soon.